we'll be looking at the moral argument in the 20th century and beyond. And once again, we'll just be looking at the highlights, nothing comprehensive here, but at least a sketch. So let's start with C.S. Lewis's argument from Book 1 of Mere Christianity. You might encapsulate it something like this. Premise 1. We experience whatever it is that is directing the universe as a law that gives us instructions and urges us to do what is right. Premise 2. The only thing we know that can give instructions is a mind. Therefore, whatever it is that is directing the universe is more like a mind than anything else we know. Moving on to a contemporary of Lewis's, Austin Farrer. Austin's moral argument is based on a recognition of the sacred dignity and value of persons, such that it's best explained by this, that what deserves our regard is not simply our neighbor, but God in our neighbor, and our neighbor in God. Such an argument can be couched in various ways, but it's basically predicated on an important recognition that people have a sort of intrinsic worth and value and dignity that naturalism has a very hard time explaining. Longtime University of Michigan Christian philosopher George MAVRODES' article, Religion and the Queerness of Morality, was a very important piece in the history of moral apologetics, emphasizing the ontologically odd nature of binding moral duties in a naturalistic world. I put this article up for your perusal as an optional reading assignment this week. I'm not requiring it, but I do strongly encourage it. Probably the most important work on moral apologetics and theistic ethics that's been written in the last 100 years or so is Robert Adams's Finite and Infinite Goods. Instead of putting this major work on the supplemental reading list for the course, I thought it merited attention all on its own. So for those of you who want to become premier, world-class moral apologists, let me just say you simply have to read this book. I can't begin to do it justice in just a few words, so I'll leave it at that. I'd like to, at this point, interject MARILYN Adams, not because she has a full-blown moral argument, but she says something that's very interesting I'd like to share with you. She happens to have been Robert Adams's wife, and they were both great philosophers. But here's just one piece from her writings. In addressing the problem of evil, she wrote this: if divine goodness is infinite, if intimate relation to it is thus incommensurably good for created persons, then we have identified a good big enough to defeat horrors in every case. Moving on to Linda ZAGZEBSKI, she identified 3 ways in which we need what she calls moral confidence, particularly in light of the sometimes costly nature of doing the moral thing. 1, we need confidence that we can have moral knowledge, good reasons that our individual moral judgments, both about obligations and values, are correct. 2, we need confidence in our moral efficacy, both in the sense that we can overcome moral weakness and in the sense that we have the causal power to bring about good in the world. And 3, insofar as many moral goals require cooperation, we need confidence in the moral knowledge and moral efficacy of other people. To avoid skepticism about such matters, skepticism which simply cannot be rational, we must be able to rely on more than our own human powers and those of others in attempting to live a moral life. And then there's Steve Evans, and you're familiar with him. In addition to what you have read, he also couches evidence for God in terms of what he calls natural signs, following 2 Pascalian constraints of being widely accessible and easily resistible. Among natural moral signs, he considers moral obligations and human dignity, that latter point echoing Farrer. Distinctive features of moral obligations make them especially significant, he thinks. And what are those features of moral obligations? Well, I'm going to tell you. But note again Evans's attentiveness to detail here. It's so important if you're an aspiring moral apologist to slow down, be patient, and be observant. Be attentive to the relevant details. The features of obligations that he notes are these. They, 1, provide a verdict on our actions. 2, bring reflection to closure. 3, involve accountability or responsibility. And 4, hold for persons as persons. In his The Recalcitrant Imago Dei, J.P. Moreland characterizes a recalcitrant fact as one that is obstinately uncooperative in light of attempts to handle it by some theory. Such a fact doggedly resists explanation by that theory. The particular recalcitrant moral facts, he thinks, on naturalism are threefold. 1, objective intrinsic value and an objective moral law. 2, the reality of human moral action. And 3, intrinsic human value and rights. I have referred to John Hare numerous times throughout this course already. Hare spends significant time laying out the two aspects of what he calls Kantian moral faith, the arguments from grace and from providence found in Kant. Here's another familiar figure, William Lane Craig. Craig is best known for offering this deductive formulation of the moral argument. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. You will note that this is modus tollens, which is a deductive argument form and a valid one at that. So if anyone wishes to oppose the argument, they have to argue that one of the premises is false, or that the likelihood of their both being true is less than 50%. Steve Layman gives another moral argument that's rather interesting, and it goes like this. Premise 1, he calls the overriding reason thesis. The overriding or strongest reasons always favor doing what is morally required. Premise 2, he calls the conditional thesis. And it goes like this. If there is no God and no life after death, then the overriding reason thesis is not true. And basically from there he goes, if both 1 and 2 are true, then either God exists or there's life after death in which virtue is rewarded, something like karma. But supposing there is something like karma, who on earth would direct such a labyrinthine and complicated process as that, except God himself? So either way, you have reason to believe that God exists. Finally, to wrap up this whirlwind tour of the history of the moral argument, I might just say that guys like Mark Linville, Scott Smith, Paul Copan, Angus Manouge, and Angus Ritchie have all given rather interesting variants of epistemic moral arguments for God's existence, arguments based upon the fact that we have moral knowledge.